There we go. Oh, 10 people now. 10 people who just joined. We have someone calling in. Fantastic. Fantastic. All right. Yeah. Just another 2 minutes and then we'll get started here. And I'm actually feeling like oh, hey, another person. Hello, Tom. Hello, Tom. All right. So yeah, Tim, I'm gonna hand this over to you now.
Great. Thanks everyone for showing up tonight. For everyone who hasn't usually heard the spiel, this is Our Revolution Arlington's June 2021 meeting. My name is Tim Dempsey. I am filling in tonight for our dear comrade here, Dan G. Dan is a little under the weather, and so he's been asking us to kind of pick up a little bit of the slack for him tonight, which I'm happy to do. So the backstory on us, Our Revolution Arlington, got started as a group in 2016 in the wake of the Bernie Sanders campaign that year. We've been organizing here in Arlington since then. Our Revolution Arlington is a non-aligned political group. We are basically willing to work with anyone who is here in the county and in the state that is aligned with us on our political issues. So we are not aligned with any particular party or organization. We are a policy-focused organization and working at this local, state, and national level to bring progressive change to every aspect and every level that we can of our society. So I wanted to introduce our topic for tonight, and this is a really great. I think it's going to be a really great talk tonight. I mean, we've had a year since the murder of George Floyd, and so there's been a lot of attention being paid to reignition of the civil rights movement, its tactics, its comparison with civil rights groups and figures of the past. But what we saw here is the group, that there's been a kind of major lacuna of these discussions, and because they're frequently ignoring and potentially even kind of writing out the radical politics that underlay the civil rights movement. So we wanted to have a speaker who would come and talk to us about how civil rights figures like Fred Hampton and Robert F. Williams were influenced by anti-capitalist politics, and philosophers and figures like Karl Marx, Vladimir Lenin, and other socialist figures and philosophers. So because we feel like without really understanding these roots, it's not really possible to have a full picture of the goals and tactics of civil rights movement, both past and present right now. Even though we are seeing some of those politics and some of those sentiments come back now in some of the more radical inflections of the current civil rights movement in the form of Black Lives Matter and other groups such as Cooperation Jackson and others. So tonight we've invited assistant professor at Auburn University, Austin McCoy, to give us a kind of talk, to lead us in a discussion of the Black radical tradition, and to kind of give us a history of that. So I will, without further ado, turn it over to Austin to lead that discussion. And thank you so much, Austin, for joining us tonight. We very much appreciate it, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thanks for the context and the introduction, Tim. Also like to thank Daniel for reaching out to invite me to excuse me, give a talk about the Black radical tradition. We spoke briefly last weekend, and I was just curious as to some of the context, some of the conversations that y'all were having about this topic. And he mentioned the sort of what Tim was talking about in terms of the sort of erasure, or the de-radicalization of the civil rights movement over time. But then he also brought up a conversation that some of you were having about Judas and the Black Messiah, and how you can have a whole movie about Fred Hampton and his life as a Black Panther, but not talk about the Panthers' radical politics. And now what I want to do today is try to give you all a little bit of context as to why that might be, in terms of like, how did this process unfold? But then also talk briefly about some of the people that appear, or that could or should appear in histories of civil rights in the United States, especially once we take a sort of a broader look at the movement itself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen and pull up the PowerPoint I have. And I emailed Daniel like a few minutes before the talk to send a PDF copy of my slides. So he has a copy of those. There's also my information. You can reach me by my email at Gmail, and there's my Twitter handle if anyone wants to follow me there. So, and another warning, sometimes like this computer, it's my work computer, but it's time for me to trade it in. So sometimes the PowerPoint might, lock, and I might have to hit the escape and then go back in and reload it. It doesn't take that much time, but that's just a warning in case it does happen to freeze. Sometimes it happens when I'm teaching my students. So just wanted to give a heads up for that. So what is Black radicalism? What is the Black radical tradition? So it sounds like some of you probably might know some of this information already, but for those of you who do not, who you see on the screen is Cedric Robinson, who is a scholar, theorist, and author of Black Marxism, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition. And he wrote this book, or published this book in the early 80s that was he did a deep history, or sort of an archaeology of Black radicalism, especially among Black people within the diaspora. So he went back to sort of try to understand, one, the roots of Marxist theory, but then also he also incorporates the roots of colonialism, capitalism, and sort of is trying to give us give us an analysis of how did Black people, how did Black people in the diaspora, especially Black radicals, one, where did the radical politics come from? So what are the roots of this politics? But then also, how did they engage left-wing politics or left-wing theory, in particular Marxism? And his major argument is that Black folks have this sort of complicated, if not contentious, relationship with Marxist theory. And what ends up happening is you have folks like W.B. Du Bois, but his other examples are C.L.R. James and Richard Wright. But then there are going to be other people that I talk about today who, they do an analysis, of society and their situations, and they incorporate some Marxist ideas, but then they also sort of, what ends up happening is they begin to see that there are limitations to Marxist theory, and it's sort of explaining the totality or the complexities of their experiences as Black people or even as Black women within the diaspora, and within sort of coming up in the midst of industrial capitalism. And for Robinson and for other scholars such as Robin D.G. Kelly, some Black folks, they sort of move through Marxist theory. They will continue to utilize it, but they may not participate in the Communist Party. But then there are some activists who remain within the Communist Party, and I will, talk about an example with that. So, sort of to give a rough definition of the Black radical tradition, like I said, it challenges Western liberalism, and liberalism with a sort of small L, coming out of the 19th century. It also critiques Marxist theory, like I said, but it fundamentally challenges U.S. nationalism, exceptionalism, and racial capitalism. Its roots are in, the history of slave rebellions and early abolitionist politics. But as many of you probably already know, the Black radical tradition, it's left-wing. It is anti-capitalist, anti-racist, anti-imperialist, as well as anti-patriarchal and abolitionist. It is also anti-fascist, but its anti-fascism extends beyond the criticism of German Nazism and Italian fascism that sort of, took shape in the 1920s and through the 1930s. Many folks out of the Black radical tradition, including Angela Davis, George Jackson, who were both sort of, prison activists, and I'll talk more about Angela Davis later. They also saw colonialism, U.S. capitalism or U.S. imperialism, and state violence in the United States as manifestations of fascism as well, right? I mean, so they take a more expansive understanding of what fascism means. But as we know, many Black radicals, many of them are Pan-Africanists, they're internationalists, and many will seek to advocate for or organize multinational, class solidarity, right? I mean, so while there might be some Black radicals who participate in independently led and ran Black political organizations, like the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement, which was a Black-led revolutionary worker movement coming out of Detroit in the late 1960s. They still work with other white radicals, right? I mean, so many Black radicals do believe in some sort of vision of a multinational class solidarity or some sort of internationalism. So one of the sort of topics and one of the issues that Daniel came to me with sort of thinking about this talk was, so how does the civil rights movement, how do we, forget, basically, how are we forgetting the participation of Black radicals in this movement that, took root in the United States, and depending upon who you ask or which historians you ask, civil rights movement might have started after emancipation. It might have started with the institution of the NAACP in 1909. Maybe it started within the 1930s with the sort of radical interracial labor organizing that was taking place among communists in the Congress of Industrial Organizations. Or maybe it was the 1954 Brown v. Board decision, or even what happens the following year in Montgomery, which is the Montgomery bus boycott, right? I mean, depends upon who you ask when the civil rights movement starts. This talk is sort of going to be more expansive and sort of think about earlier periods, but there are some political and some cultural reasons as to why the civil rights movement has been de-radicalized. You see some of these examples on your screen. The United States, I mean, this is stated and obvious. The United States is anti-communist, and it is, sort of always been hostile towards left-wing politics, stretching back into the 19th century with the crushing of the interracial populist movements. So there's been a history of the repression of the left, and, sort of more related to the civil rights movement, we've seen a series of Red Scares. So one, like the first one sort of coming after World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution. And the United States, it passes laws granting itself power to spy on its own citizens, to jail them, but also to detain and deport immigrants. But there are also state governments that pass criminal syndicalism laws, which were aimed at banning labor organizing. So they criminalized labor organizing, especially the radical variety. But then, yeah, you even have Eugene V. Debs, who ends up running for president as a socialist. Garners more than 1 million votes while in jail, right? I mean, so this is an example of this first Red Scare. The second one, coming after World War II, you have the Red Scare, and there are laws that are passed, right, that criminalize communist politics. So you have the Smith Act and the McCarran Internal Security Act, both passed in 1950. You also have the creation of the House Un-American Committee and the rise of McCarthyism, which seeks to again silence communists, many of whom have been participating in the labor movement, many of whom have been fighting for Black rights, fighting against racism. So you have this that takes place. You also have a Lavender Scare that takes place, which is you had folks who are part of the U.S. government who are also trying to purge the government of queer folks. So purge the government as well as purge folks from politics, right, who were queer. And usually queerness and communism were often linked. But then we also have in the, which sort of takes shape in the 1950s, sort of blossoms in the 1960s, the invention of COINTELPRO, but as well as police violence, mass incarceration. You have corporations that fire radical workers. So this is sort of another wave of repression that takes place. And usually this hostility, right, towards communism and left-wing politics is linked with racist hostility towards Black activism. So white Southerners also link Jim Crow in anti-communist politics. You had some white Americans who saw the civil rights movement as a quote communist plot, right? I mean, so again, we saw that sort of, you lived in the South, you saw that today with some of these smears of the quote unquote squad, that are, in Congress right now. Like there are a lot of, political ads that were running on TV that sort of linked them to, communist politics even, right? I mean, they were reaching back, you have folks reaching back into the 1950s for some of their critiques. So here's an example of the, of an attempt by, white Southerners to try to smear the civil rights movement. So this is a billboard with Dr. King and others who were at the Highlander Folk School, which was a labor school, basically, a labor school, but they also did political education around civil rights, and they taught organizers. And Dr. King, as well as Rosa Parks and many others, had sort of, came through the school. I believe Rosa Parks might be in this picture. I think this might be her right here. So, this was a billboard that was erected, somewhere in the South, trying to make this link between Dr. King and communism and civil rights. But there are also cultural factors that go into de-radicalizing the civil rights movement. So, there are these master narratives of US history that emphasize American exceptionalism and a belief in the expansion of citizenship rights and participation in capitalism, right? I mean, so this idea of integration, and it's usually sort of captured within the phrase, quote, a more perfect union, something that you hear liberals even, use today. It's something that Obama like to use during his tenure and beyond. So, US exceptionalism, which is, and US nationalism, which, they're both sort of anti-communist, right? I mean, that's how American politics has been framed. So this is one reason why you might not see an emphasis on radical politics, because it just doesn't fit within our master narratives. But then there are other master narratives of the civil rights movement that I've sort of, gestured towards, right? I mean, so there's another belief that the civil rights movement only, began in 1954 and ended with the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And again, in this narrative, there's a emphasis on nonviolent civil disobedience, as well as the goal of being integration in legal equality, right? I mean, so if you limit the civil rights movement around these parameters, you're going to miss a lot. You're going to miss Black Power, obviously. You're going to miss the urban uprisings of the 1960s. You're also going to miss much of the radical labor organizing that was taking place in the 1930s. You're even going to miss a little bit of the fight against lynching, right? I mean, because it just doesn't fit within this time frame. But then we also see, news media that focuses on, heroes and villains. It focus on sensational events such as the March at Selma, and also sound bites that sort of get integrated into these narratives, right? I mean, and the most famous sound bite comes out of Dr. King's speech at the 1963 March on Washington for Freedom and Jobs, right? I mean, his sort of references, the phrase, by the content of the character, right? I mean, these are just sound bites that even conservatives today still try to pull and use to sort of define what civil rights means and what it means for this country to sort of quote unquote progress. And then lastly, and this is something that resonates, right now with conversations around critical race theory. There's an emphasis on behavioral and individual expressions of racism by intentionally, quote, bad actors, right? I mean, so you have to be able to prove intent, which is embedded in the law, right? I mean, that's how jurisprudence, approaches racism right now, and with denials of, systemic racism. So, those are some of the reasons why the movement has been de-radicalized. If anyone has any questions about some of the political reasons, there are political reasons in terms of, civil rights organizer strategies, but I want to make sure I'm not going over too much. So here's a list of the people, events, or organizations that, had these folks were either radicals or had some sort of connection to the Communist Party. And Tim had mentioned Robert F. Williams, right? I mean, he could be on the list. There's so many other people who could be on this list. But I'm only going to talk about a few today. So yeah, like Stanley Levinson, might be someone folks may not know. He was one of Dr. King's closest advisors. I mean, he's believed to have been a member of the Communist Party. But it was something that he had to deny during the 1960s, right? I mean, Bayard Rustin, he was also a member of one of the, socialist organizations, had a relationship with A.J. Musk, who was also a radical. And he had to play the background on whether it was, trying to advise Dr. King around the Montgomery bus boycott, or even planning the 1963 March on Washington for Freedom and Jobs. So, like some of these folks had, like they, were sort of pushed to the background because of their, communist sympathies or their radical sympathies. But the first person I'm going to talk about is Claudia Jones. So Claudia Cumberbatch was born in Trinidad in 1915, and she immigrated with her family to the United States. So she and her family came over to the United States in 1924. She joined the Communist Party, the CPUSA, and involved herself in the campaign to free the Scottsboro Boys. And these were the 9 Black boys accused of raping two white women in Scottsboro, Alabama in 1931, right? I mean, so again, sort of issues pertaining to, quote, criminal justice, but then also issues related to sex and class, right? Also, should be thought about when thinking about the civil rights movement. Jones was also a journalist, and she wrote for the Daily Worker, and she led the party's Women Commission. Now, she was also a pioneer in theorizing what, Kimberly Crenshaw coined as intersectionality. While she considered herself a Negro woman communist of West Indian descent, Jones critiqued communists and progressives for failing to consider a particular position or the particular position of Black women workers within the capitalist economy. So she identified a super exploitation of Black women domestic workers that were left out of New Deal policy, as well as Marxist theory. And while it may be a stretch, though, to call her abolitionist in the contemporary sense, she was very critical of the anti-communist legal apparatus that criminalized radical politics and facilitated her imprisonment and deportation from the United States. So Jones was indicted for writing an article entitled "Women in the Struggle for Peace and Security," She was imprisoned for this in 1951 under the Smith Act, which forbade participation in the Communist Party. And in an interview, um, after she, so in an interview she gave after she deported, she, made this declaration, right? I mean, I was a victim of the McCarthyite hysteria against independent political ideas in the United States, a hysteria which penalized anyone who holds ideas contrary to the official pro-war, pre-reactionary, pro-fascist line of the white ruling class of that country, the United States, right? I was deported from the USA because as a Negro woman, communist of West Indian descent, I was a thorn in their side in my opposition to Jim Crow racist discrimination against 16 million Negro Americans in the United States. So like many other incarcerated radicals, Jones criticized the inhumane conditions of her imprisonment. Her analysis of what scholars call the carceral state or the criminal justice system, quote, stemmed from her experience. And it's reflective of a Black radical politics that, like I said earlier, viewed fascism as a more subtle form of reactionary politics and violence that were embedded in US institutions of government and the private sector. Claudia Jones is someone that we don't often talk about. Carol Boyce Davies wrote a great book about her called Left of Karl Marx. I've included a bibliography at the end of this talk. For those of you who want to take a look at the slides on your own time, you can take a look at the bibliography and you'll find that text there. So the next example is civil rights unionism. So like I said, many American communists and socialists, as well as those who migrated from abroad, were instrumental to labor organizing in the United States during the 1930s and 1940s. Members of the Communist Party helped organize labor unions in cities like Birmingham, Alabama, Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and Detroit, Michigan. And Black workers typically responded affirmatively to communist organizers and its politics because the party's commitment to disrupting white supremacist conventions and its advocacy for civil rights, right? I mean, so there were more Black folks who were sort of moving towards the Communist Party in the 1930s than in an NAACP. And this caused the NAACP to sort of have to sort of work harder to sort of organize among Black people during this period. So NAACP also ends up taking up some labor causes as well. So for Black workers in Birmingham, the party had earned goodwill through their unequivocal defense of the Scottsboro Boys, who the party believed were political prisoners in a class war. And the communist legal arm, the International Labor Defense, also helped Black people organize against lynching, police shootings, false arrests, and sexual assault against Black women. Again, a more expansive view of civil rights. So Black communists like Hosea Hudson in Alabama and Nelson Davis in Detroit, they would gain prominence in the Congress of Industrial Organizations, or the CIO, during the 1940s. And both were elected to office, of the CIO in their respective locals. Black communists and communists generally supported Black workers' civil rights demands such as fair and full employment, union wages, housing and education equity, voting rights, and healthcare, while advocating for a more expansive vision of industrial democracy. Yet, many were victims of political repression. So conservatives not only attacked the labor provisions included in the New Deal, such as the Wagner Act, they sought to separate organized labor from communist and socialist politics. So the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947 forbade communist labor unions. It also forbade unions with communist members to be recognized in US labor law. This allowed the CIO and its affiliates, including the United Auto Workers, to purge some of its most effective organizers and organizations. So it allowed them to purge communist unions and individual communists, right? I mean, so, this is sort of the onset of the Second Red Scare. Now, almost done. So the next example is the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. And most of us are, we're very familiar with the Panthers' anti-police brutality work, but we don't, always pay sufficient attention to their survival programs, so the free breakfast program, sickle cell testing, programs for kids that sort of turned into Head Start later on, as well as their ideological development, nor do we really think really think much about their sort of analysis of prisons. So leaders such as Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, Fred Hampton, and Kathleen Cleaver, they continued the tradition of the Black tradition of taking the quote dialectic and dialectical materialism seriously. And the Panthers over time would evolve their ideology and politics from a Black nationalist position to one advocating for international socialism, right? And you sort of see a quote from Huey Newton that sort of reflects this, reflects where the Panthers sort of end up by the 1970s. But the Panthers' anti-fascist and anti-state violence politics arose from their analysis of and encounters with police and experiences with imprisonment. So like the radicals before them, so like the international workers of the world or the Wobblies, the communists, et cetera, the Panthers viewed the US prison system as an institution of political repression. They believed all who were in prison were in prison as political prisoners. Also, though, Newton, he actually sketched out a vision of a people's police force as a sort of answer to racist policing, right? I mean, so this people's police force would sort of, exist within Black communities, and it would comprise of regular Black folks to be selected randomly. And he suggested that the Panthers also set up a revolutionary court. But for Newton, no justice system worthy of its name could exist within the system of capitalism, nor could it exist within a political culture that was anti-radical and repressive. And I have a quote here. He says, and I quote, "You can't have isolated pockets of human treatment when reaction is pressing in all around you," he told the press in an interview in August 1970, right? I mean, so the Panthers, they had a abolitionist politics, but one that sort of would sort of resemble Angela Davis and others who followed in terms of, trying to replace, current systems, racist systems of policing with a more just form of public safety. So for Davis, abolition does not entail dismantling police, prisons, and other institutions of the carceral state. For her, it entailed establishing what was called a, quote, abolition democracy. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the term abolition democracy, it was a concept that W.E.B. Du Bois used to describe Black and white abolitionist efforts to construct a new post-emancipation society in the South where Black workers would enjoy full political, social, and economic rights. So abolition democracy then, as he wrote in Black Reconstruction, was about the tearing down of slavery, but then also the building of new institutions that would be more democratic across the board. So not just political democracy, but also economic democracy. But in Davis's adaptation of the term, it obviously did not include just abolishing the death penalty, prisons, and police, but and she says here, in thinking specifically about the abolition of prisons using the approach of abolition democracy, we would propose the creation of an array of social institutions that would begin to solve the social problems that set people on a track to prison, thereby helping to render the prison obsolete, end quote. So Davis, again, is falling in this long tradition of the Black radical tradition that was outlined by Cedric Robinson, but sort of, articulated by folks like W.E.B. Du Bois, decades before. And as we know, right now, out of the various strands of Black politics that have persisted since the mid-20th century civil rights struggle, Davis's, as well as others like George Jackson, who was a prison activist, Miriam Kaba, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, these folks' abolitionist politics have emerged as extremely influential in our era. And as we saw last summer in the midst of the George Floyd uprisings and protests, many Black activists and organizations, many of whom practice abolitionist politics, had called for defunding the police departments as a strategy, not necessarily as the goal, but a strategy towards that end. So I'm going to stop my talk right now. Like I said, there are some, some sources that I have that you all can take a look, when you would like. But I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. And if folks want to ask questions, if that's what we're doing, then I am more than happy to do so.
Great, thank you so much, Austin. That was amazing, a talk on that really diverse and rich history. And I mean, I'm sure you could have probably talked to us for several hours, and I would have certainly been glad to hear it.
Yeah.
But yeah, since we've paused, or since we kind of wrapped up that active portion, I'd like to turn it over for people to ask questions. I don't know if people want to try to use the raise your hand, or just want to unmute yourself and go for it. Anybody?
Okay, I'll just go for it here. Let me lower my hand. Thank you, Dr. McCoy. That was fascinating. I'm really glad to have been here to hear that. I'm interested in the de-radicalization that was occurring in the, I guess it was late 60s even and 70s. And I wonder, like, you know, I've read takes on the current wave of Black activism that is more critical of it being kind of like separated from the Black radical tradition. I was wondering if you're familiar with those takes, or if you had any thoughts about that, because what you described, you know, it does make sense that you know, that current Black activism is very much still embedded with the Black radical tradition. And the thing I noticed was that, I'm sorry that this is getting to be a long-winded question. Yeah. The thing I noticed, or the thing that I saw being talked about, was that some of the critique was coming from the older generation of Black activists who are now, like, you know, leading NAACP or are members of Congress and such. So I was just really wondering, like, if you have any comments, any thoughts about, like, the critique of the current Black activism and the de-radicalization, like if there's an intersection there.
No, that's a really good question. And so sort of thinking about this, right? I mean, so yeah, there is, when doing organizing work, and I'm sure many of you have probably might have experienced this, excuse me, sort of in general, but then also when you're sort of examining or observing Black politics, there are often these sort of quote generational divides, and you know, in the sense of you have a newer group that sort of emerges, and then there becomes questions of, okay, could we, the NAACP, sort of incorporate, you know, this younger group into our organizing, because one, it would, you know, I mean, in a practical sense, sort of bring in fresh blood, but then on the other hand, you can kind of control it, right? I mean, so this actually happens in the midst of the sit-ins in the early 1960s. So when you had young Black folks sitting in, and this tactic is spreading, and it's a tactic that was, you know, had its roots in labor organizing, right? I mean, with the sit-down strikes, but Black folks hadn't been using this tactic. And so, yeah, young folks across the South using this tactic, and you have people who are beginning to ask, okay, so, you know, are they part of an organization? What's going to happen with them? And it's really like, you have folks like Ella Baker, who suggest, like, hey, like, you know, or like, how about, you know, folks get together and try to sort of devise a direction. And as this sort of conference is being planned, you have folks like Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, as well as the NAACP, who are sort of thinking, well, if we have you know, this might be another base that we could sort of use in our own organizing, right? So what ends up happening is there ends up being this debate. Are these students going to be the sort of the youth arms of the SCLC or the NAACP, or are they going to be something else? And what ends up happening is Ella Baker advocates strongly for these students to sort of, no, you should be your own organization, make your own decisions. So that's how the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee sort of comes to be, right? I mean, so that's sort of a slightly, different type of example, because you don't sort of see any sort of public critiques that are sort of being thrown around, like what happened, in the midst of the Ferguson uprising. But it is a sort of historical example of when you have a younger, like a group of younger folks who sort of burst onto the scene, who are using tactics that might be more disruptive. There has been this tendency among older folks, especially within the Black movement, to sort of try to co-opt them, and then they realize they can't, so it's like we have to work with them. This is how you get someone like the president of the NAACP in October 2014 at the National Ferguson mobilization gets booed, like by all the activists, because the president tried to come on and tried to critique the organizers and the activists for their disruptive tactics. They almost all but boo him off the stage, right? I mean, but then over time, folks like groups like the NAACP, folks like Al Sharpton, who was also critical initially, they came around because this is where Black politics, Black activism was heading, and over time they had to recognize that. And usually, you'd hope that folks would recognize this sooner, but it doesn't always happen, right? I mean, it's just a lot of folks, sort of see Black activism as a zero-sum game. If there's one group that is sort of, quote, leading, then that means it must mean that other groups must be de-emphasized. But no, this is something that's historical, and usually it works itself out through folks using disruptive tactics and sort of making the most noise. That's typically how, that's the best counterweight to the sort of like the long-standing institutions of civil rights.
Thanks for that extended response. That was really great. Is there anyone else who'd like to ask a question?
I will just say thank you for extending the education. Thank you for adding to my reading list.
No problem. That's one thing that we can do. That's one thing that we're pretty good at doing as scholars. Like, go read all these books.
Oh, is somebody else?
Tim? Yeah, Tom.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would be very interested in hearing your views on, I guess, sort of the class analysis that was used in the 60s, and your understanding of what has happened to it now, whether it's been co-opted or forgotten. I just have in mind, when you listen to people like Chris Hayes on MSNBC or wherever he's chattering these days, I mean, he's saying a lot of things like, it's a colony within a country, which is what the Panthers were saying in 1968. It was basically your basic Leninist anti-imperialist view of capitalism. But one thing that makes for coalitions is understanding that different people in different races are classes. Do you see that now the same way it obtained in the very late 60s and very early 70s?
That's a really good question. No, that's a really good question. So I think what's happening now, which is like really interesting. So on the one hand, I think our analysis, I think a lot of folks' analyses of power, especially as it relates to the police department, often intersects with some sort of class analysis, right? In terms of the role that the police, might play in the United States, especially as it relates to capitalism, right? I mean, so it's often seen as an institution that is the primary defender of private property, at least within U.S. borders, right? I mean, and obviously there are other institutions, but then in terms of, okay, so how does this translate to what does solidarity look like, really? So there are a couple ways of going about this, right? I mean, so on the one hand, I think there are folks who do practice a sort of multiracial, sort of a class-based solidarity in sort of discrete ways, right? I mean, so obviously the Fight for 15, that was sort of taking place over the last, I think, for the last 6 or 7 years. But then also you have, some, Black Lives Matter activists who are sort of serious about a class analysis in terms of, again, thinking about the police, but then also sort of seeing themselves, embedding themselves among Black workers, seeing themselves as workers. Now, I think there is a question sort of, or a conversation to be had about, what does, like, why isn't there sort of more of a explicit conversation about class solidarity? But I don't think this is just sort of pertain to activists on the ground. I think you sort of were hinting at it when you're talking about Chris Hayes, but then, yeah, there's this language doesn't, I think there are people among the, sort of the left wing part of the Democratic Party who sort of gesture towards it, but it's just rhetoric, in some ways, right? It's not sort of coming, it doesn't appear to sort of come out of an analysis of political economy like it might, such language might have had during the 1960s, where you had the Panthers, but then you also had the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement that saw themselves as workers, as part of a proletariat, as part of a vanguard that would work with other white workers as long as they were willing to acknowledge the racial aspects of capitalism, right? I mean, like that sort of discourse, we don't really see that discourse. And no, it would be interesting to see more of that, I think.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Yeah, good question.
Andrew, did you want to ask a question?
Yes. I think
Andrew, I think you muted yourself.
that's why it's not going. But now it's kind of an echo. What am I doing?
I can hear you well.
I don't know, I can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah, the echo is probably just on your end.
Well, thank you, Dr. McCoy, for your comments and your presentation. It's been very interesting. What I wanted to say was that I've learned over the years that words are very important. So when you use the term Black radicalism, is that a label that the activists gave to themselves, or is that from the establishment putting it on them? And where I'm coming from is, I don't know a lot about the Black liberation movement, but there was recently a story on TCM about the Panthers, and it was during the time of freeing Huey Lewis. It was a film made by folks from Europe, and they were in Oakland at the time. And one of the leaders of the Panthers read the 10-point program. And that 10-point program doesn't seem radical to me. It sounds perfectly common sense to help your community. So I'm just wondering, words being important, is radical something that the movement put on themselves, or was it imposed on them? And is it something that should be shunned, I guess, or corrected?
So, okay, so the Black radical tradition, that term itself, so those three words were sort of, coined by both sort of activists and scholars in the 1970s and 1980s. And it sort of, is sort of more manifest in the Black Marxism book. I have a copy of it right here, right? That's manifest in Cedric Robinson's book that sort of that is published in the early 1980s, right? I mean, so you had folks like him. You also had Angela Davis, Manning Marable, who was also a historian and political scientist, who were sort of, using this phrase at times. But a lot of times, right? I mean, like these activists, whether, you're talking about the early 20th century and sort of through the 1950s and 1960s, they were calling themselves communists, Marxist, Leninists, third worldists, anti-imperialists. Huey Newton even was calling himself an intercommunalist in the early 70s. So the idea of radical, right? I mean, sort of has been termed as a sort of it's been an umbrella term for left-wing politics for decades, if not stretching back into the 19th century, right? I mean, the term radical comes from the root radix, right? I mean, and left wing comes from, sort of France, where, the folks who had the sort of more radical programs were sitting to the left of the king, and the folks who were more conservative were sitting to the right. I mean, so, the term Black radical tradition, kind of academic, kind of activist, but also pretty new. But then, yeah, there's these other host of terms that, feed in, that sort of that are put underneath that umbrella. And whether or not, I mean, like, I think, I think the spelling of radicalism or Black radical tradition or Marxism, it would be a mistake if I'm thinking as both a historian who sort of studies some of these movements, but then also as an activist. I mean, I think you sort of defang yourself when you want to try to moderate your terminology. And you're also not being totally politically and intellectually honest when you do. Because no, there are people in the 1970s who were using terms like economic democracy, using all sorts of terms and running away from socialists, running away from communists because of the Red Scare. But that just made things more confusing for people that they were talking to, right? I mean, so language does matter, but I would argue that precise language and sort of being able to, sort of confront the forces that are trying to force you to moderate yourself might take you farther than just trying to dispense it. And then, yeah, the 10-point program, just to be short with that, I mean, I would agree too, right? I mean, like, it's pretty American, I mean, like, they're adopting much of its language from the Constitution with some of these programs, but then it's also mixing in some of the, some of the demands around creating a United Nations plebiscite, sort of also influenced by the anti-colonial movement of the time.
Thank you.
Yep.
Austin, I guess I'll invoke moderator privilege to ask what I guess will probably be the last question. The one thing that I think is actually like a red thread that kind of runs through a lot of those earlier traditions of Black radicalism, just to use that term for convenience here, is that there was there was obviously like a very kind of stark internationalist kind of perspective, and they were very much, a lot of the radicals at that time were very much interested in what was going on, international struggles, what the US was doing abroad and things like that. And I've seen just some critiques from older Black radicals that have said, like even the more radical manifestations now that we see of kind of new civil rights movements here in the US, like Black Lives Matter, have not been focused as much on that. However, I will parenthetically, or maybe not parenthetically, but to maybe contrast that with the fact that I personally have been very happy to see that there have been a lot of Black Lives Matters activists that have been involved in the recent protests regarding Palestine, Israel. Mm-hmm. And I think, even the New York Times had, I think, an article recently about how that has influenced a change in discourse here in the US regarding, Zionism and American support for Israel. But I just kind of wondered what your thoughts on that particular critique is. And, yeah, so that I guess my question.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I think it dovetails nicely actually with, I think it was Tom who mentioned the sort of, the issue regarding class analysis, right? I mean, and so I think, so there's something that is missing in terms of the context, so of this current moment, because on the one hand, I would say that, older activists who are, critiquing folks for a lack of internationalist perspective, I think they're right. I do think they're right. But I think there's a couple things that are missing. And there's something that was missing with the class solidarity piece. So in terms of the class solidarity, what we don't have right now are strong labor unions, right? We don't have a CIO. We don't have, left wing, strong like unions that are national. You have local unions that are, and you have UAW who might, funnel some money and some resources, but like you don't have a strong institutional base for class solidarity. Just like we don't really see a strong movement, if not institutional base, for internationalist politics, right? I mean, because in the night, the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, you had, the Soviet Union, and obviously that's a very complicated, like that's a very complicated, force, right? But you also had China, you also had Cuba, so like you had these nations that were sort of, sort of uplifting and sort of amplifying, revolutionary movements abroad. So like you had those states, you also had these other anti-colonial movements throughout the African continent, in Latin America, right? I mean, so you like folks in the 60s, especially, were living in a swirl of international revolutions. So, it wasn't going to be, it wasn't going to be difficult to sort of draw connections between your struggles and those abroad because they were so salient. But then also with it being so encompassing, you weren't going to be as vulnerable either politically, right? I mean, like, still, yes, you could be fired from your job from being a communist. You could be fired from your job from being a radical. You could be blackballed. You can be all these things. But it still even kind of made sense to people, even if they disagreed with you and wanted to smear you, right? Whereas right now, I think with the movements now, yes, I think they're more, nationalist in the sense of they're not everyone is looking abroad, and we should be looking abroad more. But then also there are movements, that are critical of Israel, but then there's also a big pushback that I think has sought to sort of do its own Red Scare in terms of having a lobby that's able to get people fired from their jobs. As like one example, which is something that happens in academia, right? I mean, so like there are struggles to look towards, but I think these struggles abroad, even when they're successful, they're not felt as being as salient to people, because of our context, right? We don't sort of have an institutional base for internationalism, but then also obviously the U.S. media, right? I mean, like, so we are sort of receiving very slanted coverage of international events, right? I mean, so it's pretty hard to sort of understand what's going on unless which sources to sort of look to, which texts to read, which stories to read, who to follow on Twitter. So I think things right now are a whole lot more defragmented, but that doesn't mean that activists shouldn't be trying to work harder to try to develop institutional bases for internationalism and a more internationalist perspective.
Thank you. Beautiful, beautiful answer. Well, it's about 8 o'clock now. I want to be respectful of your time because I think we could go on all night. But I just want to give you ask everyone to give I guess silent round of applause. Thank you so much for giving us your time tonight and for absolutely sharing. This is really great. We'll share your PowerPoint so people can follow up on some of those sources. And I mean, there's a lot to read there anyway and to unpack. So thank you again, and thank you for all the work that you do. We'll be in solidarity with you.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. Thanks for taking the time to listen. And no, I appreciate y'all.
Very mutual.
Take care.
Okay, have a good night.
You too.
Thanks, bye. Okay, thanks everyone for for coming out and the wonderful presentation. I wanted to kind of shift. I don't know if Dan, or sorry, not Dan, but Joe, if there was any housekeeping that needed to be that we needed to take care of.
No, not as far as I'm aware. This is primarily what we didn't have much of a meeting last week, so I think this is it. People. I mean, other than open forum and letting people talk about things. No, I don't know.
Okay, all right, that's fine. Is Kristen Hoffman still here? Kristen, could I put you on the spot to talk a little bit about the rally you organized this past weekend?
Oh, sure. Yeah, it was better attended than I expected it to be. So thank you for everyone who came out. We did a rally in front of it was at the Crystal City Water Park, the park with the water feature. And that is across the street from just one of the 5, leased Amazon buildings. We're still pressuring Senator Warner. I'm a little disappointed there weren't more like journalists around, but we had some professional photographers there. You can see some of the photos on the Our Revolution Virginia Facebook page. Link them, like them, share them around, and keep making calls. Every Wednesday, we are still meeting outside of across the street from Senator Warner's Alexandria luxury townhome worth approximately $5 million. He lives across the street from a public park. So we meet there from 8:15 to 8:45 every Wednesday morning. We are on, I think we're on week 13 now. At first, I thought it was a little cheesy. They were doing like delivering cakes to his doors, but it's kind of become like a little bit of a community affair on, what kind of ideas can we come up with for putting on this cake. So it's actually been like a unifying thing. But it's a group of Coalition to Repeal Right to Work in Virginia, a bunch of reps from various local unions, and some Our Revolution people. A couple of candidates have come out. A couple of presidents of unions have come to visit. So everyone is welcome. Absolutely, keep the pressure on, keep calling. We've done postcards. Like Dr. McCoy said, we've got to have strong unions, and that, is one of the things. We've got to get rid of the filibuster so we can get the PRO Act. And if unions are strong, I believe that really helps us. They will show up with us to support things like the Green New Deal so we can have green new jobs. They will show up for things like Medicare for All, because that allows more money for wages and contracts. It's, I think, union infrastructure is, of vital importance to raising, wages and the economic, justice that we need in the country. So I've said enough. Thanks. What can I answer any questions?
I have a question, Kristen. Has he made any formal response? Has he said anything formally about the activism?
So they know we're there. The first 2 weeks they did accept the cake, and then they just kind of were like, oh, we don't bother leaving us with the cake. We're not going to eat it. So they had been asking, the groups have been asking to have a meeting with him, and there were various excuses, and then it was outright said, well, when you guys stop meeting, then we'll meet with you. When you guys stop meeting outside on Wednesdays, we'll, and it's like, no, that's the excuses will just continue. So yeah, the one excuse that he's given for why he doesn't support the PRO Act was his faux concern for gig employees, which, we could probably have a whole, conversation about how unjust gig, employment is, and that he doesn't think it, promotes it. But we did have, actually a couple of speakers who are rideshare drivers united. They're kind of a precursor to a union because they don't have the right to unionize, and PRO Act would actually allow that, where they would still be considered, contractors if they are in fact contractors, but they would be able to, organize as employees in order to, raise everybody's, benefits. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I was wondering what the union turnout was, 'cause I saw that they had been there at the county board meeting in support of the collective bargaining for our public employees through AFSCME.
Yeah, and that's our speakers made it over in time. The union that was in force at the Arlington meeting didn't make it over, but we did have like CWA, some UAW folks, and just various people who were just in unions, but their whole union hadn't gone. We had reached out to 32 BJ, and they had an event already planned. So sometimes you can't get all the calendars to coalesce,
Right,
but we
of
didn't want to
course.
do it. This coming weekend is Juneteenth, so we weren't gonna detract from that.
All right. Well, thank you so much for organizing. Obviously, it's just your indefatigable energy is much welcome. Injection,
Oh no,
especially.
the fatigue is set in at this point. Yeah, the fatigue
Well,
is set in.
it's okay. You can take a break from one every once in a while. I speak from experience.
Yeah.
So thank you so much.
On that note, on the note of fatigue and everything, I had some things to add. So I don't know if everyone here saw, but ORA is going to be going on a hiatus for at least July. We lost Dan S. is going through some personal stuff, and he needs a medium break from politics. I have what I'm dealing with right now, which is taking up a lot of my time and energy. But I do want to keep the ORA community active and alive, and I want to be able to keep promoting events like this ProAct rally that Our Revolution National in Virginia helped organize and things like that. So what I have done is, and I'm going to post a link to this in the chat, is I create a Discord server for Our Revolution Arlington. So far we have about 10 people there, and it's a place where you can just chat with other Our Revolutionaries. You can discuss politics, news, elections, have casual conversations, post any events that might be coming up that you think would be of interest to people. I could post events that I think could be of interest to people. So if you don't have Discord, and I imagine a lot of you don't, you just go to discord.com, you download it there, and I posted a link to the server in the chat. I'm going to send out more emails about that in the as in the coming weeks, because I would like to build that up. So I just want to make people aware of that.
Great, thank you, Stan. Thank you so much for everything you've done to kind of keep things moving along. And certainly, I think that's a good opportunity for us to continue to communicate as a group. So, I sorry, what's up?
Hi.
Okay. One thing I wanted to mention is that we had sent out, I think we mentioned this in our the listserv email, but one of our longtime Our Revolution members, Jeff Elkner, has been working with another one of his groups here in Arlington, Nova La Sierra, to organize a worker-owned cooperative, cleaning cooperative for that is mostly going to be run by immigrant women in the neighborhoods there in kind of southwest Arlington. So he's looking to raise, they're looking to raise some money. And for whatever, I haven't had a chance to talk to Jeff about it, but they're not right now currently doing that online. They are looking to get some checks from people at this point. And I'm going to post the information here in the chat. But they've been working on this for throughout the pandemic. I was in some early meetings on it. So we're we'd really like, I'd really encourage people to try to help out. I mean, I know that everyone's asking for money, but it's nice. It'd be a really great kind of community-based enterprise here that's kind of living up to some of our own principles here and some of the work that we've also tried to do over time. So yeah, so if you have more questions about it, you can call Jeff. I think his number's there. But I don't know if anyone has any questions about that.
Right. So,
Go ahead.
So yeah, they were they're starting with 3 cooperative members, and they've organized their entity, and they need insurance, and they're collecting money to get insurance to start their business, and they also would like us to once they have their advertisement sort of set up, they want us to share that amongst all of our networks so that they can start getting the business running, and then they're going to start getting more and more members in this co-op. So so yeah, we would be providing the push that would actually start this economic enterprise up.
Great, thanks, Dana, for that context. I had missed their meeting on Saturday, so I wanted to attend, but I couldn't make it happen in the end. But yeah, so yeah, we'll be sharing more information as we get it. Especially, I mean, I'm certainly willing to help contribute even money to help them advertise. I think it doesn't cost too much to put out an ad in All Now, for instance. But so yeah, exciting development for sure. Dana had actually asked me in the chat if we were going to provide a analysis of the election, the primary elections here in Virginia. I personally not prepared to do that, although maybe that is something we can include in our August meeting. We can do a little bit of digging, maybe even get somebody like Ibrahim, Samira, or Lee, if they're free, to maybe come offer some of their own thoughts about it. It's a very sad, very heartbreaking for me to see them lose their seats, because they've been very stellar delegates, very progressive, and they've really been 2 of the leading challengers of the power of money in Virginia politics. So it's just it was very devastating. It really is any word I can use to describe them losing their seats. And obviously, I'm also not particularly thrilled to see Terry returning to the governor's mansion, but I think, frankly, the governor's race and the lieutenant governor's race speaks to why we really need things like ranked choice voting to be the norm here. Terry did win an outright majority, but the presence of ranked choice voting might have changed things. People might have been more willing to vote if they thought that their vote wasn't going to be wasted, which is the case when you have multiple candidates running in a general election. So yeah, we'll talk about that in the steering committee, and hopefully maybe we can get someone in to provide more kind of structured discussion of that outcome and what it means for progressive politics in Virginia, because it does seem like something of a step back, but we'll see moving forward. And it's always going to be a struggle, and I just we despair, unfortunately, is not really an option, at least not in the long term. So so thanks for suggesting that. That's we'll definitely figure out something on that score. Was there anybody else who had anything to add in terms of just a general announcement or something we should be looking at?
I had a general question, Tim. This is Andrew. OR Falls Church is having an in-person meeting tomorrow night at Busboys and Poets at 6:30, and I was wondering, I know we're taking a hiatus for July, and we've lost summer, so I'm wondering if there's thoughts about as things open up and as we regroup in the fall, finding a location as wonderful as Summers, because man, that thing was perfect.
Yeah.
Or what the strategy might be, or thoughts.
Oh, I can speak to that. Last I checked, we were looking at Ireland's Four Courts across from Summers. That's where we had the at least one of those debate watch parties. That seems like a place where we could regroup when we're doing in-person events again.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks, Dan.
Is there anyone else, any other updates that they'd like to share? All right, well, I have an update, which is that on the work that we've been doing as part of the Arlington Fiber, we've been working on getting broadband, to get the county to look into providing a public broadband option for Arlington County. We successfully lobbied them to put in money this year for a feasibility study. It's not very much, it's about $50,000. But we recently had some conversations with the 3 board members that we feel are pretty solid on it and will vote in favor of it. So we talked to Christian Dorsey, and he seems amenable to expanding the amount of money that might go forward to that. We are trying right now to see what to propose in terms of the scope. We met with a veteran consultant on community broadband. And he gave us a lot of great feedback. So we're going to be meeting as a group either the week next week or the week after next. So if people are interested in joining that conversation, feel free to send me a message here. But we're cautiously optimistic that we'll move forward. The board will move forward, looking into providing public broadband option that provides people some refuge from the cable monopolist of Verizon and Comcast, and that really looks to kind of bridge our digital divide, because right now the pandemic is kind of crawling to an end, we hope, and that the children are going back to school, but the pandemic only highlighted the real crisis we have in terms of people being connected. The internet is, as all of us here right now using it for this meeting, we know that it's really critical. It's a critical function that people just need to have access to at home, either for free or a very low price they can afford. So we're going to continue doing our work on that. And like I said, if people are interested in joining that, feel free to reach out to me or Detta as well. That's my my contribution to the public forum. Well, Dan, Joe, is there anything else that needs to be mentioned?
I don't have anything else.
I do not have anything.
All right. Well, if no one else has anything else to add, I guess I'll adjourn the meeting. Thanks, everyone. Great to see you.
Charles.
Charles, go ahead.
Just a big thanks again to all of you, but especially Dan and Joe and Dan also for keeping already going through this time during the post-pandemic time, making sure that there was a place, a forum, virtual or whatever, that we all kept aware. And even though I know it's painful to take this break, I think we all in this struggle need to also practice self-care. And I think that's good too. So I applaud you all for knowing when to do that and leaving us a forum to still stay in contact and Discord. So thank you, particularly Dan and Joe and Dan for that, and you all also, all the many other voices and people who were there too.
Thank you, Charles.
Dan, did you mention, and maybe you mentioned it earlier, but sorry, I had a call at one point, but the Discord?
Oh, yeah.
You got that. I'm sorry.
I dropped a link. I dropped a link to that in the, yeah.
All right. Well, I guess that's a wrap then. Once again, thanks everyone for coming out tonight. And we'll see you, I guess, then in August and hopefully sooner at some other events, in person or wherever. So have a good night, good week. Peace.
Good night.